Hi, welcome back, and we're going to talk about a new topic today, fermentation. Now, this is a shorter video. I will release some extended videos diving deeper into this topic just because it's a little bit more complex. Now, a lot of us already know that in order for fermentation to occur, we need sugar and yeast. And whenever I'm explaining fermentation, I always think of that Alton Brown video. I think you know the one I'm thinking about, of all the burping yeast. So in its simplest form, fermentation is sugar plus yeast equals alcohol and CO2. But it's a lot more complex than that, so let's break it down. Yeast is a single-celled fungus. While studying wine, you'll likely come across this term, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is yeast. It is found everywhere, and I mean everywhere. It's on you, it's on your clothes, it's outside, and now we think outside, it's on different fruits like grapes. So now if you imagine it, you can see it, think about in a vineyard, and we're harvesting some grapes, and there's all these little single-celled fungi on there, all these different yeast, and you take it to the winery, crush the grapes, and now look, all of that natural sugar inside the grapes is in contact with those yeast, and now what we call a wild fermentation can occur. So that's one type of fermentation. We have wild fermentation. We have things like native yeast fermentation, which doesn't necessarily mean wild, and highly controlled fermentations with commercial yeasts. So glucose and fructose are the two predominant sugars found in grapes. And we can also touch on sucrose for just a moment. It is known to be more stable than the other two, and like in heat, it stays more stable, and heat does occur during fermentation. And for those of you who just want to be a little bit more nerdy about this and learn, I wouldn't say you necessarily need to know this to be learning about wine, but sucrose, like I said, it's more stable in heat, and it actually breaks down in acidic environments, whereas glucose and fructose are more unstable in alkaline environments. Sucrose will break down in acidic environments, and that's, we have a lot of acid in grapes. So just really interesting little side note. And in those acidic environments, the more acidic it is, the faster that breakdown occurs, and that breakdown is essentially turning that sucrose back into its monosaccharides. So with winemaking specifically, like I said, we're talking about the glucose and fructose, and every grape variety is different. Some of them are higher in one of those sugars than the other. And when we get a little bit deeper into this conversation, we'll talk more about how some of these sugars are considered more or less sweet than the others, but you don't need to know that right now. Just know that glucose and fructose are the predominant sugars in grapes. Okay, how about alcohol? What is this? Speaking about alcoholic beverages, we are talking about ethanol, also known as ethyl alcohol. This is the chemical compound responsible for that thing that just makes you drunk or tipsy, what people call the effects of alcohol. And it is an addictive and harmful substance that is known to affect things like mood and motor skills. And this is why we always recommend drinking in moderation. Now, when we put all of this together, how does fermentation really affect the final wine? Well, that first one is obvious. We get alcohol. The fermentation is taking that sugar and fermenting it into alcohol to turn grape juice into wine. But if you're working with wine as a professional, it's really important for you to know that fermentation will affect things like flavors, aromas, and the texture of the finalized wine. Because think about it, most wine tastes a lot different than like regular grape juice. So let's dive into that a little bit. We'll start with texture. Now, you may have heard people talk about legs when they're talking about wine, and with that, they're really referring to the viscosity. Now, what does viscosity mean? Viscosity is essentially referring to how much a liquid can move within itself. My favorite comparison is water versus olive oil. Water has very low viscosity. It moves so freely, and olive oil is a highly viscous liquid, and it's really thick when it's moving around that glass. Okay, cool, but what does that mean when we're tasting wine? Well, viscosity is related directly to two things, which we can actually break even further down into one thing: sugar. So when a wine is looking really viscous, that's telling us one of potentially two things. It could be high in residual sugar, or it could be high in alcohol, because remember, alcohol comes from sugar that's fermented. Or it could be both. And those are things we can also taste. Sugar is fairly easy to learn to taste because think about it in food, you already kind of know the difference between things that are sweet and things that aren't. But alcohol can be a little bit tricky, and we do have some techniques that we'll teach you throughout these courses of how to really be able to tell what that alcohol level is when you're tasting. But just a little basic for you, alcohol is what causes that kind of warm and burning feeling. And one technique is, depending where you feel that burn, that can relate directly to the amount of alcohol in the finished beverage. Okay, what about those flavors and aromas that we mentioned earlier? How does fermentation affect that? Because isn't it just like the grapes taste like something and then it's fermented and now we're gonna have that in it? Yes and no. Flavors and aromas are all about different chemical compounds. And yes, all different components of the grapes have some of these in there. This is a little bit more of a very complex subject on its own, and we will have separate lengthy videos on that. But I do want you to know right now that fermentation also affects that because there is a chemical change in that. So we have different aromatics from the grape itself, and then that's crushed and fermented. So things throughout the winemaking process like fermentation and aging can affect those overall flavors and aromas. And little side note, texture too. Now, this video is about fermentation and not the science behind taste and smell. And I know that's really exciting things to get into, but as I promised, this is a shorter video, just a very basic introduction to fermentation. And I will have information on all of these topics later because they are just so complex and it would be way too lengthy to do this all in one. So please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you want to keep learning about wine and potentially start a career as a sommelier. And I offer this for free because I don't believe that anybody should ever pay an exorbitant amount of money for education and training just to do a job. So this is kind of my give back to the community and a lot of people who are really interested in potentially starting a career in wine. So I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you for watching the video, and please remember to drink responsibly.